I'll be here to do with you whatever you decide. I just want to let you know we can let our feelings grow because we seem to have the love and care. Well, I care about you. I feel that you're a friend and that you care about me too. It's so nice for someone to know they have a number one. It's nice to be a number one for you, to care about you.
Hi everybody, this is Richard Sachs. I'm your host on Lost Arts Radio. This is our show for worldwide broadcast on the 24th day of June 2018. And this will be a fun show for me because an old friend of Doug's and mine, Russ Tanner, is going to be on with us, which is great. And been hoping for months that this would happen soon. And I first met Russ when I was a co-host along with him. What's the right grammar? Him, right? Yeah, him, because it's an object, not a subject. Remembering 7th grade English. But I was a co-host with him and Dane Wigington on Geoengineering Watch Radio. And that was a really educational experience for all of us, and I was there for a few months. And Russ and I have stayed in touch frequently since then. And we've gotten a lot of good referrals to people to talk to and other things with Russ. And he's running a great website called globalskywatch.com, I believe it is. And there's even links on that site to anti-geoengineering groups all over the world. And I've used those links before. They're really handy to communicate with people with similar interests all over the place and get a little bit more tight organization and awareness of each other, which is really kind of a big deal for the people working on positive things, because the negative power structure is highly organized and they're all following. Well, I guess that's possible for them because they all follow orders which come from a centralized power point. And with most of us, we're totally independent, and most of us don't even know each other exist. So this is our chance to have Russ with us, just focused for a couple hours on a little bit of the information that he's gained over so many years of involvement with the whole anti-geoengineering movement. And the way I'd like to do it is, first of all, as we often do with inspiring guests, is go back into their background, introduce them as a person, see what they experienced in their past that led up to what they're doing now, and then explain what's going on now and what they're hoping for the future. I think that would be great. And I want to do it from the point of view, not for all of you guys that know all about geoengineering already, because it's kind of fun, but it doesn't expand to the people who need to hear about this as much. So I want to consciously start from the basics when we get to that point and bring in the people who don't know what a geoengineering is or have no idea what a chemtrail is, except that they know it's a conspiracy theory. And we want to go back into actual basic logic and show everybody that it's not an unproven theory, it's a proven theory. And what that means that we need to do if we want the biosphere to survive. So we have a lot to get into in a very short time. Welcome, Russ, and thanks for the time and being here. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's great that we finally get to get together and talk about these things.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, we've had so many great discussions impromptu on the phone spontaneously, and then we think you usually bring up the fact that was a whole radio show we should have recorded and never did.
It's funny how often we say that. It's like, wow, we'll talk, 45 minutes will go by, and we're like, wow, we just did a show. The information that we cover when we talk is just phenomenal. And there's only a few people in my life that I can have that kind of discussion with, and I always wish we recorded it.
They should be recorded, yeah. It's highly immoral of us to be doing this off air.
Yeah, yes, we have to stop keeping this secret from the public, and we have to get it out there. So that's what we'll do today.
Okay, so what I want to do this is for people that know nothing about this, and the other guys can just come along and enjoy it in addition. But for the people who never heard of any of this stuff, Let's start with you as kind of a regular person going back as far as you need to before you knew about this stuff, and what happened in your life to get you into it. What were the steps? And let's go step by step back up to where you are now.
Well, if I go back to the beginning, and I'll do this real fast, as a child, I was really interested in jets and rockets. I was obsessed with that technology. I had a dream when I was in elementary school, I wanted to be the first person on Mars. I thought that would be just the coolest thing to travel. So I collected pictures of jets and rockets, and I amassed a tremendous collection, inches thick of paper over time of photographs of jets and rockets and information I wanted to have.
Started when you were how young?
Probably 8, 9 years old.
You had unusual focus for a little kid.
Yeah, well, actually, it began before that. I mean, I remember, right around there. 7 or 8 is when I began the process, and then I began collecting, maybe 8 or 9, I began collecting the pictures. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that kind of plays into where this is going, because I had a kind of a pretty extensive amateur background of knowledge in how these engines work. I would love looking at the diagrams of the engines, how they work, how the compressors work, and the shafts connect to the fan and the high bypass part. All of the components were fascinating because I love engineering. I would have been an engineer if it wasn't for the mercury that got put in my teeth when I was a teenager. And that plays into this as well. Because
the average person is going to say, mercury in your teeth, you must be some kind of conspiracy theorist. That would have nothing to do with being an engineer.
And they did when I first started telling the public about it. So when I was a teenager, I started getting fillings, mercury fillings, the amalgam-based fillings, and I started having all kinds of strange problems. Like I had acne. I broke out with acne just terribly, to the point where they had to put me on an antibiotic. I started having bouts of depression, where I was extremely depressed and just had trouble functioning. It took all my mental energy just to function, and other things went on. It just a whole host of things began to happen to me, and of course, I never made the connection. Now,
so try to send you to the psychologist or the psychiatrist or something to get you cured?
Well, we actually did, to improve our family relationships. I actually did, not just me, but our family did go.
Counseling.
Did go to counseling for a while. Right. Just to try to improve all our relationships. And
if that happened now in the first visit, you'd be on 5 drugs.
Probably, yes, probably. So I had fillings put in, and this all plays into what's going on because I learned a lot through this whole process. So let's fast forward to the year 2000. Between 1995 and 2000, I started having terrible, terrible symptoms to the point where I didn't think my life was going to last much longer. Had everything from candida to digestive issues to headaches to terrible fatigue, short-term memory loss. My short-term memory became so bad that when I was giving tech support on the phone, I would have to keep a word processor open in front of me on the computer and write down who I was talking to in notes about the conversation, because I would forget. I know that sounds extreme, but I was doing everything I could to just maintain functionality. Thank God.
That would be so stressful, worried about trying not to have that come across in your conversations.
It was very stressful because I'm typing while the conversation is going on, trying not to make the clicky sounds too loud, because all the keyboards back then were clicky, and hoping Windows 2000 didn't crash, because that was, or Windows 98 before that, because a couple of years before that is when it started happening. Yeah. So fast forward year 2000, November, I was working with July, about a month before that, working with a friend of mine, and we got to talking while we were taking a break. I own my own business, and we were learning how to use Dreamweaver together to design websites. And during a break, we were talking, and I told her that I had a tooth shifted in my mouth just dramatically overnight. It shifted position, and my teeth have always been quite perfect. Yeah. And that really disturbed me, that there was actually like a 1 or 2 millimeter shift in one of my teeth. And first thing she said to me, she goes, "Do you have a filling in that tooth?" I'm like, "Yeah." She goes, "It's your body rejecting the mercury." Wow. And I said, "Wow. The what? What are you talking about?" She said that she had fibromyalgia. She was bedridden. It took her 5 years of going to doctors until finally she went on the internet, started researching for herself, found out that her fillings had mercury. She was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, put on all kinds of medications, one after another, one doctor after another. Mm-hmm. She went on the internet, found out that there was mercury in your fillings, began to have them taken out, got out of bed and went back to work. And my jaw just dropped. I'm like, they have mercury? Because I was familiar with mercury and how toxic it is.
They're not mercury. They're silver. Everybody knows.
Sure. Let's call them silver when they contain the world's most toxic non-radioactive metal. So this intrigued me.
That's ridiculous. Nobody would ever put that in something in your body. I mean,
of course, especially not people in charge of the nation's health.
Right.
Who would set that kind of policy?
Yeah.
So that was everybody has these revelatory moments in their life when they get hit over the head with a 2x4 and they realize that is the answer I've been looking for. And that was the moment when she said that and said that they have mercury in there. I said, that's it. I've been looking for 5 years to find out what was wrong with me. So this all plays into chemtrails because I had my fillings removed in July of 2000, had the best night's sleep that I've ever had in my life. Before that, it took me 2 hours a night to get to sleep, and I woke up with wet sheets. I'd have to wash my sheets every day because I would sweat.
Wow.
And I could go on, and I had 17 physical symptoms. I had emotional symptoms, hyperactivity, anxiety, fear, depression, all of this stuff going on. All of the physical symptoms have vanished in 24 hours after my amalgam removal, all of them. Well, 85% of all of them. Within 3 months, all of the physical symptoms and all the emotional symptoms were absolutely gone. I felt better than I had in my entire life. And I'm sharing this very emphatically today because this is an epidemic today. Mercury toxicity is a silent epidemic. There have been books written about the silent epidemic of mercury, and mainstream media has covered it up. And I believe the reason they do that is because mercury is possibly the most profitable substance to the pharmaceutical industry, which very heavily influences our mainstream media in multiple layers. So mainstream media news is not going to talk about it.
The average person, though, can't, if they're looking for a profitable career, they can't just become a mercury trader too easily, right? You have to be in some kind of an inner circle to have access to it, I would think.
That's right. I mean, it's the idea...
It's quite racist, actually. They're keeping access from all the regular people.
Machiavellianism is a word that often describes a business model of creating a problem and then selling the solution. This is exactly what they are doing. No scientist, how dare somebody call themselves a scientist who would approve the idea of putting the world's most toxic non-radioactive metal in your mouth and then make claims that it doesn't leak out because it's bound as an alloy for years, decades and decades.
In many ways, actually.
I mean, there were actually news stories from MSNBC that actually claim that mercury is...
Yeah, I remember seeing that, actually. Yeah, that mercury may actually help, not harm children. That was the quote.
Yes, they actually did it. It ran, and then, of course, the story never ran anymore because I think they got a lot of negative backlash from that because people are not...
They're not quite unconscious enough yet to safely run stories like that.
That's right. That's right. So my feelings came out. I felt like Superman for 4.5 years, and here's where chemtrails enter the picture in November of 2005, or actually during 2005, I started seeing white lines in the sky occasionally, and I was perplexed because I'd never in my life seen white lines in the sky coming from jets, except at an air show, video of an air show, or when you have a jet fighter that turns on its afterburners. Those are the only times I've ever seen a white line come from a jet engine. And at the same time, I started having some health problems, headaches, sleep issues, fatigue, joint and muscle pain. In November 2005, this activity started daily. And I lived at Jamestown, New York at the time, and I worked from home, and I had a window that overlooked the whole city, and you could see all these jets crisscrossing the sky and leaving these lines. And about 20 to 40 minutes after they would do these were really low-flying jets. They looked like they were 747s, DC-9s, 737s, 707s. These are all jet airframes, by the way, that are used by the military as tankers. Just keep that as a side note.
So you're not talking about airliners?
No. We're talking about jets that I didn't check at the time, but they were unmarked. So I can only presume they were military. And the other thing is Jamestown only has a small airport that can't handle larger jets. Can't handle large commercial jets, only small, what we call puddle jumpers. So you never see jets in the sky over Jamestown. So this caught my attention that overnight, Well, not overnight,
but
over
state are you talking about?
Year. But overnight, they started spraying daily with these large jets flying at very low altitudes, and 20 to 40 minutes after these trails were released in the sky, I would smell it, I would taste it, and I would get terrible inflammatory symptoms, pain, headache, fatigue. In fact, the first day that it happened, that we had the strongest aerosol release that I had encountered, and it started daily. This was the first day that it started daily in November 2005. It was going on before then occasionally, but that was the day that it really, really started heavily. I canceled my employee meeting. I had 3 employees at the time because I had such a headache and I couldn't think and I was in terrible pain. It was the first time, and I just canceled the employee meeting. Said, I can't function. There's something in the air. I can taste
what
the
state
metal.
Is Jamestown, Russ?
What's that?
What state is Jamestown in?
In New York, Jamestown, New York.
New York, okay.
It's in it's in western New York, about an hour from Erie, Pennsylvania, about an hour from Lake Erie. Beautiful rainforest area because it's like a rainforest because it gets lake effect, rain and snow from Lake Erie. So it's a lot like England in the sense that the weather's often overcast and rainy, but it's beautiful land, rolling hills, just beautiful. Yeah, so there's my short story. Try to make it short, but that's what happened to me and woke me up. In that day in November when we had that super powerful aerosol release, I went online, researched, and found information about chemical aerosol injection. And I realized that this is what was going on because as a lifelong sky watcher and a collector of thousands of pictures of jets and rockets from my childhood, I have never in my life, I lived on military bases. I lived in the busiest airspaces in the world. I spent most of my growing up was north of Tampa Bay, and you pretty much can't look in the air without seeing a jet flying overhead. In fact, every couple months we'd see some 2 fighter jets, usually it was 2 fighter jets in formation, go right over our heads from MacDill Air Force Base, which is in South Tampa. So even the fighter jets didn't leave trails back then.
Right.
So that's what happened, and that's how I got introduced to this subject. And being that I was someone who, number one, had a background with an amateur background, but reasonably educated background in high bypass turbofan engines, how they work, and why or why not they would leave trails. And I had a history of collecting pictures, and I lived in the busiest airspaces in the world, and I had mercury poisoning, which will come up a little later in this discussion, I'm sure, and the fact that I can taste and smell them.
Well, that was the biggest deal because most people are not consciously aware of the taste and the smell. So you were set up to be the valuable resource to educate people because you could tell right away when this stuff was drifting down from the trails to where it was perceptible, which is pretty fast, I guess. You don't have to wait a long time after the spraying, right, for you to be able to perceive it.
Correct. And so I feel like all of these things came together, and, many people who have been active in a particular cause will say that you get called. It's not that I chose this cause chose me. Right. And I feel like that I have to speak out. I have a very strong conscience, and if I do not tell people as one of the minority of people who have a very sensitive sense of taste and smell, and therefore there's not 1 ounce of doubt that the symptoms that I have are coming from these aerosol releases and the people around me. I see the people around me who suffer when the air gets really strong. Yeah. Even if they can't smell it, they still have symptoms. It's my duty to be the watchman on the wall and to speak out. And isn't it interesting, Richard, that they keep the intensity of the taste and smell just low enough so the majority of people can't taste and smell that? Is that a wild coincidence? Just a wild, or is it intentional?
Everything's a total coincidence, right?
Just a coincidence. A coincidence.
So one of the things I want to get into that you mentioned about the white lines, again, with the theme of bringing people along in this discussion who don't have any idea about this stuff, but they might be willing to listen. And I have had discussions with the Weather Service, National Weather Service, that explained to me very slowly so I could understand, not too long words or anything, because, they're scientists and all. And they said, they tried not to say anything that would be like, really insulting if they could help it, even though they knew that my understanding was very little. And they said, look, for the average person to understand this, we have changes in weather conditions, in the atmosphere. Sometimes, and talking really slow so I could understand, some jets will not have anything visible coming out the back end. Other times, because the weather conditions change, or the atmospheric conditions that regular people can't tell change, and then they have white lines coming out the back. It's really not complicated, and they're telling people this all over the country and maybe all over the world. So I want to go back to the level where people haven't even thought about this issue before, and explain to them, if you can, why this may not be what's really happening.
Well, first of all, the theory of condensation trails, which are supposedly trails that engines can make in the atmosphere, and they're supposedly dissipating very quickly. That is the story that we're being told by governments, by congressmen, by the mainstream media, now by children's textbooks, and it's all happening globally at the same time. This information, how long have high bypass turbofans or even low bypass turbofans, which are, if any engine was going to produce a trail, it would be a jet or a low bypass turbofan, much less likely a high bypass turbofan. But why all of a sudden is the whole world being re-educated into this idea that these engines can produce condensation trails? Well, NASA publishes the information that you need to have certain conditions. You have to have a certain amount of humidity. You have to have temperatures of negative 40 degrees Celsius or lower to produce these trails. The problem we see, here's the fundamental problem, and this is the same problem you see with in the 50s and thereabout. You had mainstream media using doctors to promote the safety of cigarette smoking. And
they were good for reducing stress, too. And for soothing your throat also, if I remember right.
Exactly. And throughout history, you have mainstream media, you have different industries that were pushing the safety of their products or their processes on mainstream media, and they always back it up with science. I have captures of news advertisements from the 50s and 60s in mainstream magazines that say, fact, cigarettes do not cause cancer, and it's all based on science, lab reports, scientific study says, so on and so forth.
I would love to get a copy of that if you get a chance.
Certainly. I don't have a hard copy. I have a digital copy.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Absolutely. So here's what we have going on today is the whole world is being educated in this idea of condensation trails. Well, back in 2000, if you go look in archive.org, you can look at Wikipedia, and you will find that one of the pictures depicting a contrail was the trail that comes from a wing when the jet is heavily loaded and it's under full flaps. What this does is creates a low pressure zone near the end of the wing and a low pressure zone on the top side of the wing. And when you rapidly decrease air pressure, the air can no longer sustain that condensation, the moisture in the air, in tiny particles that are invisible to your eye. Right. So there's an immediate condensation effect of those particles. In this photograph, it's no longer on Wikipedia. They removed it. But this was part of the definition of a contrail back then, which has now been changed to what a trail that comes out of an engine. And there's more.
So this says that, if I understand what you're saying, that a jet that's on approach landing with the flaps down to keep it up at lower speed, that you might see some kind of contrail coming out of that?
You might see a trail coming from the wings. Usually it's just outside the flaps when it's under full flaps and in high humidity conditions. Then you may see it momentarily. And usually those trails only last a few feet and they're gone in less than a second. Sometimes they do persist, and they're called wingtip vortices. This can happen if you see a jet fighter flying really fast and it pulls up real fast. Well, you create a real fast low pressure zone above the wing. And because of the way the air travels down the wing, from the fuselage outward, it'll actually rotate. So it'll make these kind of cool looking patterns. But of course, those are under very rare conditions, but that has nothing to do with the engine. We're talking about wingtip vortices and low pressure zones creating a trail after the wing. We don't see in all the photos that I have, in all of the sky watching I've done all of my life, living on military bases and collecting pictures and living in the busiest airspaces in the world, flying every year for a large portion of my life, all the time I was growing up, never saw a trail coming out of a jet engine. Never even thought about it. In fact, if I saw it, I would think that there was a fundamental problem with the jet. Yeah. So that's the idea of a contrail that the whole world is being indoctrinated into right now that historically doesn't exist. We're seeing history revisionism taking place right now because they're actually teaching people that these trails have been around forever and this is nothing new, and that's part of the propaganda. But as a person who's in his 50s, who has watched the sky and collected pictures, I will tell you right now, these trails, if they ever existed, coming from jet engines, I never saw one.
So is it reasonable to say then that there are no conditions under which a white trail would come in the back of a plane, either from the engine or the wing or anything else, that would persist for hours? Is there any natural condition where that could happen?
Well, if you take the word natural out, I was going to say yes, maybe a bird strike, where you have a fundamental engine failure, yes. I do not, in all of the literature I read, back in my childhood and growing up, back through the the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was nothing that taught us that trails come out of engines. But now we're seeing literature appear saying that it does. So no, I don't know of any natural condition that would produce a trail from a jet engine, aside from an air show where they have to put a special additive to the fuel that produces smoke, or when you have a jet fighter that has its afterburners on and it's extremely inefficient and emits a lot of partially burned fuel.
Yeah, and it is interesting that it's very important to the authority figures in all through federal down to local government, apparently, and in industry as well, which is kind of indistinguishable from government at this point. And it seems to be important to them that we believe that in most conditions, a lot of high-flying jets or medium-flying jets produce long white trails, and it's totally normal.
Right. It's amazing the coordination is happening worldwide, in countries and textbooks in almost all the countries of the world that we have seen. And this is all happening at the same time. We've had high bypass turbofans for 60, 70 years now?
Do you want to explain what that means for people that don't know?
High bypass turbofan?
Yeah.
Yeah, high bypass turbofan is a turbine engine. It's shaped like a Coke can. Let's take a Coke or Pepsi can, a soft drink can. And everybody's seen these engines on jets. One end is the intake and one side is the exhaust. The way that it works is that you have a cylindrical core in the middle of this engine. And that is where fuel is actually burned and expelled out the back. But if you were to look straight at the back, it's like a donut. In the middle, the hot exhaust is actually expelled out of the turbine. Mm-hmm. But around the center, you have a donut, which is actually called bypass air. 85% of the air that comes out of the back of a jet engine is bypass air. That bypass air is pushed through around the turbine, the center turbine core, by a large fan, which is in the front of that engine. The proper name for these engines is called a ducted high bypass turbofan. The word duct means to enclose. Just like in your house, you have ducts. They're enclosing the air that's passed to the different rooms. Yeah. Well, a ducted turbofan is basically, in a way, you could look at it like a prop engine, except it has a duct around it because that makes it a lot more efficient.
Well, the difference between a propeller and a turbine, if I understand it right, is that a propeller gets powered by fuel and it pushes air, whereas a turbine is something that spins because it's pushed by the air. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, a turbine, the core turbine of a high bypass turbofan, that they often call that the power plant. That's where the power comes from to actually turn the fan that's in the front of the engine. So in a way, it's really like a prop. In fact, there are prop engines that are turbine driven.
So you're saying this is just a propeller plane with the propeller enclosed inside the engine?
Basically, yes. Basically, yes. And 85% of the air coming out that is thrusting that jet forward is bypass air. It's just atmospheric air that comes in the front and then it's thrust out of the back through the prop. That's a high bypass.
And the back is a lot smaller hole than the front, right? Right.
Yeah, the air does undergo some compression as it goes through even the bypass ducts. Of course, it's compressed because the fan is pushing real hard. And that's another irony about the myth that high bypass turbofans create contrails is that air, the higher the pressure air, the harder it is to condense water in. In high school, we did an experiment where we had a big glass jar upside down on a rubber mat, and we expelled the air out of that pretty quickly, and it formed a cloud inside. Right. And what happens is when you lower the air pressure, the water condenses because you need air pressure to keep all of those water molecules separated in the air. It kind of pushes them all apart. So you have, like right now, I'm looking at my humidity meter here in my office, and it's 28% humidity in the air, but we don't see it. However, if you took and expelled the air very quickly, you would see clouds form because the air can no longer disperse those water particulates. Well, in a high bypass turbofan, you have a very high pressure condition in the exhaust or the thrust behind the engine, and that high pressure air cannot allow the water to condense into larger particulates. It takes lower pressure to condense for the water to condense.
So the engine is racing the air pressure between where it comes in and where it goes out, which means that where it goes out would be less likely to show visible condensation than where it comes in.
Right, and all of this jives with our observations. Since I was a child, I've never seen a high bypass turbofan produce a trail, and that's perfectly logical because they shouldn't produce trails. It just doesn't make any sense.
I'm still trying to grasp where the term high bypass comes from.
Okay, high bypass comes from the concept that the majority of air that's thrust out of the back of the engine is not combusted. It actually bypasses the combustion process. So about 85% of the air that comes in the front is just pushed back by the fan that's in the front of the engine, and only about 15% of the air actually goes into the turbine engine mixed with the jet fuel and then is combusted. So there's what's called a high bypass ratio. Most of the air that goes in bypasses the combustion process. Previously to this, like in the original Boeing 707s, they had low bypass. They didn't call them low bypass because there was no reason to. They were just
nothing to compare to.
Right. Now that they have high bypass, then we can go back and call these low bypass. But these were the original jet engines. They looked differently. They were skinnier. Their diameter was smaller because a larger percentage of the air was combusted in ratio to the air that was just pushed through the engine. So there
why did they
wasn't as much bypass air bypassing the combustion process. The reason we have high bypass turbofans today is because they actually are more efficient. They save fuel, and so they're very desirable for the aircraft carriers.
Okay.
The carriers.
What you mean?
Carriers.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Wow. That's a lot to absorb. That's really interesting. So those are technical reasons why you would almost never see a visible condensation line behind a high bypass engine because the pressure is so high that you'd be more likely to see it extremely clear if you could see right behind the engine.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is why historically, in my experience, and in all the pictures, and even in the old textbooks, if you look at textbooks and aviation books from 30 years ago, if you look in the index, the word contrail is not even in the book. So,
okay. And if somebody had seen one, they probably would have wanted a word for it.
Right, exactly. I mean, if you're talking about aviation and contrails are as common as mainstream media and the education system is now telling us that they've always been in the air, because that's the new propaganda we're hearing, then of course, they would have been around since the beginning of the turbine jet engines. But they weren't, and that's why these old aviation textbooks, I'm talking about aviation textbooks that would talk about the engines and how they work and what they look like, because it was a fascinating and amazing technology, which is why I was into it as a child. When I was younger, I was really into this because it is a cool technology. But they're in those old textbooks, if you get ones that are old enough, there is no contrail mentioned.
What year are you talking about?
People online have shown us books from the 60s and 70s, I believe. Mm-hmm. If I have that right, I've seen a couple people. One of them has a stack of about 10 books, and he looks for the word contrail and doesn't find the word contrail in the index of these books from that era.
Right. Okay. When did jets first start?
Back, I think the high bypass turbofan was actually designed in the 40s. I'm trying to recall this from memory here, but and in the 50s there was the first commercial aircraft that flew with a jet engine was called the Comet, and that was, I believe, that was in the 50s. I trying to recall when that was.
Was that a smaller?
But by the 60s, you had a rapidly increasing number of jets in the air, and you can find pictures back from that era. 747 has been around. I'm trying to remember when it first flew. But all the old, I have some old footage of 747s flying, and in this old footage, there are no trails behind the engines. Right. And one of the most common jets we see today, we see DC-9, we see all tanker airframes. Yeah. But 747 is one of the common ones that we see leaving trails today. Military, unmarked, silver and white jets. Yeah. And they're leaving these huge trails behind them. Yeah.
I remember being a passenger quite a few times in the early 50s on DC-3s, and, with the tail on the ground and stuff before they took off. And I don't think we saw anything behind the wings looking out the windows.
Right. I mean, the whole theory about jets leaving trails is that when you burn a fossil fuel, if you want to call it a fossil fuel, but if you burn something with hydrocarbons in it, you end up with a certain amount of water vapor that's emitted by the engine. Yeah. And we have to ask ourselves that when you're dealing with internal combustion engines, why is it that we don't see these internal combustion engines from that era leaving trails? Now, I will say that the propagandists online, there are government-paid propagandists who are trying to lie to the public, and that's a whole other subject. But they have posted the same 10 pictures of trails coming from World War II prop-driven aircraft. But right. If you do a search, and I did, and I looked at thousands of pictures from World War II era, here's what you find, Richard. This is very interesting. You find the same 10 pictures that have trails, and none of the other photos have trails. However, you find hundreds, many hundreds, even probably I crossed the 1,000 barrier of illustrations, artist renderings from World War II, and guess what? About 95% of the modern artist renderings of prop-driven jets from the World War II era, and you can find this, do a Google image search, have trails behind them. But
so they've
the real photos
the
don't.
Illustrations, right?
Right, the photos don't have them.
To include the chemtrails that should have been there. I mean, sorry, the contrails that should have been there.
Right. This is the kind of trick that they pull, because this is called conditioning or history revisionism. The actual photos don't have trails behind them, but if you look at 95% of the illustrations from the era, they show trails behind the prop-driven jets.
So we're covering a lot of potential big money careers for people. I mean, we talked about the Mercury and being a Mercury trader, and now we're talking about being a paid propagandist. I mean, a lot of great jobs that people never think of. You just have to completely sell out your sense of ethics and morality.
I had a guy call me when I was doing a radio show on a regular basis a few years ago, and he wanted to share with my audience. He said that his buddy and him and a bunch of other of his military buddies would get together every year just to have a reunion party. And they did this for years. And one of his friends started bragging recently that his former commander or one of the people that he knew in the military contacted him, and they actually set him up in a business, and he was making so much money. He bought a house by the water. Mm-hmm. He was just making a ton of money. And these guys started asking him, saying, well, what happened? What are you doing? This is what he said. He said, I have been set up in business by the military with a room full of people whose job it is to get online, create fake Facebook accounts and fake blogs to convince the public that the trails we see coming from the jets are condensation.
Wow. So is this somebody that you knew or indirectly heard about?
I didn't know him personally. He was a caller into our show. Okay. And he became very angry at his friend. They've been buddies all their lives. And he went in the military, served with him in the military, and they were good friends for a long time. But now they were at odds with each other because his friend was getting rich lying to the public, and this person who called in felt that he was betraying the American people and betraying. Yeah,
and I guess it's not that he would say, I'm not betraying them. It's just that he's saying, well, I'm having a great life. It's just, unfortunately, I have to do it this way, but I'm really getting great results from it personally.
Yeah, the way that people justify things like this is they say, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will, so I might as well profit.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think that's a very good ethic. I think that, people should come together and say, if something's harmful to do, we should just not do it. And the world would be a better place if everybody would just not do it.
Yeah, it should be in the category of common sense, right? But it's kind of been lost.
Yes, it should. It should, absolutely.
So 2005 was when you kind of put these things together and became really aware of the spray activity. And, right, I think if I got that right.
Yeah, 2005 is when they started doing it daily in our area. I smelled it, tasted it. I began suffering every day. They would pass over at night every 2 hours. There were schedules that were only, they were very tight schedules within about a 15-minute tolerance. So I knew when the next trail was going to hit. I knew that the afternoons were going to be milder and the evenings were going to be stronger. And we even had set times for several months at a time when Thursdays, for instance, was very mild. The mildest day of the week was Thursday. In fact, I didn't smell or taste any direct plume hits on us. It was just the background taste and smell of the residual particulates that they had dropped on previous days, and it was just kind of hovering there at an even level.
So it'd be recommended to do like most of your breathing on Thursdays then.
Right. Do your breathing on Thursdays and just hold it in for the rest of the week. But that was the way it was. It was so tight. And then the scheduling changed a few months later, where actually we called it the day off. We said, the day off must now be Friday, because Friday was the day where we got no direct hits. It was all just the ambient stuff that I would taste and smell. So, yeah, the scheduling was very tight and very predictable in the beginning.
Wow. So 2005 was now about 13 years ago, I guess. So what steps happened in your evolution with the whole thing since then?
Well, after 3 years or 2.5 years undergoing that very, very heavy spraying in Jamestown, I had to leave because I was getting extremely sick from it, and I was having trouble functioning anymore. So I left my house. I actually moved to Maine near my business partner's family because I had traveled here twice to check the air. That was part of the reason I came here, was I wanted to check, and it was actually much milder. Mm-hmm. And I shouldn't use the word milder because it was still better. It was considerably better. I don't know if mild would be the word, but I could actually function in this air. So I moved to the Bangor, Maine area for the sole purpose of escaping the deluge of chemical aerosols in Jamestown. It was also very frightening in Jamestown because after they started spraying, there was a massive outbreak of people we knew personally that had cancer.
Wow.
Cancer rates skyrocketed in that area, and people, everybody you knew, either knew someone or had someone in their family who had cancer within a very short period of time. And I personally know people who have now passed away from cancer in that area. And
that's when the intensity suddenly went up in the spraying, right?
Yes, right after that intensity went up. And it went up, apparently, in many places in the United States. I began getting emails from friends and relatives. And I remember one email from a relative said, "Oh my God, what is going on? Everybody is getting sick, and it seems like every week somebody we know is passing away. What is going on?" And I remember getting emails from relatives and friends saying something similar to that during that period when the spraying just expanded. The spray program was rapidly expanding across the United States.
One thing we should clarify that connected to what you talked about in 2005 when it became really obvious what was happening was your discovery that the spraying was going on simultaneous with your understanding that there were no contrails really happening. So it must be something else.
Right, exactly. I mean, all my life, watching the sky, I've never seen a trail come out of a jet. If I had seen a trail come out of a jet in the sky, I would have been very concerned and probably talked to my parents, or if I was older, I would have asked somebody for advice saying, "Do you think that there's a problem with that jet? Look at that. There's some smoke coming out of that jet. There must be a problem. You know, should we tell somebody, or do they know, or what's going on?" So yes, exactly. And when I started seeing these jets grid the sky virtually overnight in November 2005, and I started tasting and smelling it, that was the most intense part for me that made me become very actively involved because it ruined my life and it hurts. As I sit here speaking to you right now, they're spraying us with a new type they began in September last year. I call it the Sharp Metallic. It's a new flavor. It's a metallic type flavor, but it's new. And I'm sitting here suffering with a mild headache, with body pains, with some fatigue, with chest and heart pains. Not severe right now because it's between plumes. They usually hit us every 2 hours here. At least that's when the plume fallout hits the ground. But I'm suffering as we speak.
Wow. So when you moved from New York to Maine, how long until you decided something to do in response to all this stuff?
Well, actually, it was before. I discovered this in our area in November 2005 in Jamestown, New York, and I started a website shortly after that on the subject after doing online research and finding out that in some areas of the United States and the world, this has been going on for 10 years and even more. So I rapidly learned that this was a program that was being expanded city by city across the United States and Europe over quite a long period of time. But it seemed that it was 2005 when they decided to cover Jamestown. So I started a website. I believe it was 2005 or early 2006. I did start a website about this, and I was driven by the passion of my suffering, my pain.
Was that globalskywatch.com?
Globalskywatch.com is the website that I started to expose this. Yes. Yeah.
So what steps into further involvement happened after that?
Well, as I developed the website and I accumulated information, the website attracted a lot of visitors who started to become curious about this. I eventually became a guest on radio talk shows. And again, this is something I never in my life dreamed I would be doing. Complete surprise to me that I would ever be doing talk shows on this subject, much less even have this subject exist. And as I increased doing talk shows, I did expand the website, tried to offer help, aid to other people. I also started a Facebook group on the subject years ago, which now has about 177,000 people in it from all over the world, probably every country in the world, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And we just keep trying to get the word out. Our goal right now is to wake up the public to this, because without public support, it's going to be virtually impossible to make any real changes in what's going on in the sky. So we're trying to wake up the public right now.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's been a long road, long, difficult road, Richard, I'll tell you. A lot of suffering.
Yeah. One of the things that's happening across many of these issues is increase in censorship going on right now. Really noticeable increase on Facebook, YouTube, Google, and all those major platforms. So do you think at all about having to get started on putting those groups on other platforms as well that are maybe a little bit less likely to get turned off?
Yeah. I've already begun that process. Mike Adams, the health ranger from Natural News, is starting a Real Video platform, and I have been accepted into that platform.
Good.
They notified me just a few weeks ago that when it goes live, that they're going to make a place for my content there. So I look forward to working with them. And I think that America, everybody, but Americans especially, need to wake up and realize that when this kind of censorship begins happening, that this should raise, if nothing else has raised flags in your mind that something is going on. When they start pulling down videos where we're educating the public on these subjects, that should really wake a lot of people up in and of itself.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you were saying how they had paid propagandists trying to convince people that there were just contrails and everything else was a false conspiracy theory. I've noticed that they've been retroactively drawing the contrails into all kinds of animated and written materials and photographs that are historical. And I guess the most extreme example I noticed was in the movie Avatar, when they were coming down from the spaceship approaching the moon of this large planet, the spacecraft that went from the mothership down toward the planet left contrails in space. I thought that was a big step.
Yeah, you're seeing, anytime you see a jet illustrated in a picture or in a child's book, you're seeing trails behind them now.
Yeah.
And the thing that just blows my mind is I'm trying to sound the alarm saying, folks, I'm not young. I've been around a while, and I've never seen this before. This is a brand new phenomenon. Now, these high bypass turbofans have been around longer than me.
Yeah.
And we never had these illustrated in books. We never had this going on. So wake up. This is an intentional activity. And one thing, there's a program where commercial where they actually used a clip from the Railway Children. Is that what it's called? I'm trying to pull up the name of it right now. But there's a clip on YouTube where people caught this commercial that used a clip for one of the large advertisers like LG or something, used a clip from this old movie, The Railway Children, I think it was what it was called. Okay. And they show the original clip, but in the commercial for LG or whatever large corporation was using the clip, they actually dubbed in chemical aerosols in the background of the movie. So it makes it look like they were there when it was originally shot. And being that I've been into geopolitics for quite a long time, we used to learn a lot about disinformation and propaganda, because that was one of the primary weapons, is controlling what the people believe. You control what people's behavior is through what they believe. And so we learned about how they used artificially aged media. This was in the 80s and 90s. I was learning about how books were being replaced in libraries. Mm-hmm. And guess who they blamed? The Russians.
Oh, gosh. Wow. Interesting.
We used to read the McIlvaney Report and other cutting-edge whistleblowers who came out of the CIA and the NSA and other places where they had privileged knowledge. And these people began newsletters and started publishing what they had learned. And they were creating microfiche and microfilm. You know, when you go, many people today may not be familiar with it, but these are the way they used to archive newspapers. You would do it on these little transparent...
They look kind of like film negatives, right?
Exactly. And you go to the back of the library and you put it in that machine with a screen on it, and you would slide it around and you'd find the newspaper article you want.
Right.
And there are billions of records in the United States that are preserved in microfilm and microfiche. And one of the things that we were learned that they were doing from the whistleblowers back in the 80s, and this had been going on even before this, but the whistleblowers were exposing how these things were being changed. Microfiche and microfilm would be taken out of the libraries and put in by people who worked for these organizations that had fake information and propagandic information so that they could actually change the public's perception of the past. And so they would take clips from newspaper articles that were preserved in the microfilm and the microfiche. They would take them out of the library, put the new information in, and put them back in to the libraries. So this creates an atmosphere today where it's hard to even believe what you think is historically accurate anymore.
Right, because you can look up and persistent contrails were happening, 50 or 100 years ago, right? Yeah,
yes, and they were doing the same thing with VHS tapes. VHS tapes were being taken, bought in mass of certain programs or news clips or certain documentaries, and they were being changed and sold back to the public, into the public domain through garage sales and other methods, classified ads, and they would recirculate the updated propagandic VHS tapes into the public through these different, very low-level means, but very effective. And this stuff was going on decades ago.
This has to be an incredibly coordinated, well-run program, right? Not to run into all kinds of confusing problems.
It absolutely does, and this is why I've told people for a long time, if you're going to create a world government, okay, we all have heard about the New World Order, one world government. If you're going to create it, the public will never just accept it. You have to create some type of legitimized purpose for it. You have to create a problem by which only world government can solve.
Right, and the public doesn't want it. Why?
Because it takes away, it moves the power up the chain to a very small group of specialized people instead of down the chain towards the people the way it's supposed to. Just like the Constitution says that those powers not specifically delegated to the authorities fall down to the government closest to the people.
Yeah.
And people instinctively know that's the way it should be. But it's very much easier to corrupt, much easier to control large organizations, large governments, when you have a smaller number of people who are controlling it. So what they want is a centralization of power. Well, the New World Order wouldn't be accepted by the masses, so you have to build it secretly.
And anybody who questions this term New World Order, like being a conspiracy theory term, you have all kinds of recordings now of previous presidents and heads of corporations and things using that exact term in public speeches. It's not a question.
Absolutely. You have large numbers of presidents and state officials and everyone, from Kissinger to Reagan to Clinton and Nixon and Ford and it's just
both
everywhere.
Of the Bushes.
But both the Bushes. But the way that they would have to achieve this is they would have to build the global government secretly and then use the power that they achieve through that big organization that has influence in first and foremost media and government and large corporations to fool the people, to create problems that then the people's conclusion is, we need global government to solve the world pollution problem, for instance. Yeah. That is one of the primary problems that decades ago when we were studying geopolitics, I was involved in a political party and we were studying these things. That was one of the chief problems that was going to be created artificially back then. This is long before I heard of chemical aerosols, chemtrails, or anything of the like, that they would create a pollution problem that would be supranational. It would be across nations. It would be global. And so the public's conclusion to this problem would be, we have to have a world regulatory agency that will set up regulations so that we can control the pollution problem.
This must have been a huge breakthrough in the think tank meetings when they came up with that strategy, because in the beginning, they didn't want anybody to know anything was toxic. But then some brilliant person in one of those meetings figured out, hey, we can just keep using all the most toxic stuff that we want to, at least from the big corporations, but claim that we're really worried about it so that it can become a global disaster or a threat to existence. And that would lead right into the things about climate change and global warming especially. That if you got everybody terrified of that, they would be hopefully begging for world government.
Exactly. And that's what we have. And it's interesting that one of the main thrusts would be the pollution problem. And incidentally, chemical aerosols, i.e. chemtrails, I don't think there is a single source of so-called pollution that is intense. We're seeing it manifest in the soil, in rain levels of these contaminants are skyrocketing, animal die-offs, insect die-offs, respiratory issues at all-time highs in humans when smoking is at an all-time low, cancer rates because aluminum, barium, strontium, mercury are all immunosuppressive. So cancer is going to go through the roof. Everything you would expect to see during a massive release is manifesting itself right now, and it's no surprise to us who understand what's going on.
Is it all over the world now, or are there any countries that haven't really started it yet?
I searched because I was seriously thinking of moving, doing everything I could to move. It's not hard to go to, it's not easy to go to other countries, but I looked into this seriously, especially after the first couple of years, and I was suffering really, really badly, and I couldn't find a place. I had contact with people in Singapore, Russia. Of course, with the internet, it's much easier to do these things today.
Right.
People in Australia, New Zealand, South America. I checked out many countries in South America. Everywhere we looked, there was some degree of chemical aerosol spraying going on.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, so the number of airplanes it must take to do the spraying worldwide is pretty impressive.
Well, yeah, and I think that's another one of what I call artifacts. There are many artifacts to the spraying program that you'll see when you look. These are like the side effects. Well, here's an artifact for you. The Air Force has something on the order of about 400 tanker jets in their arsenal. Well, interestingly, several years ago, they went on public record saying they were renting 100 more. So that's 500. Then they had a split contract. Originally, it was between Boeing and Airbus to build 179 more. Now, that contract went to Boeing afterward because there was public outcry. Why are we giving military contracts to overseas companies? And so, but nevertheless, 179. So tell me, this is an artifact. People need to think, what massive aerial campaign do we have going on right now in the world that requires our entire inventory of 400 tanker jets, plus the rental for 100 more, plus the manufacture of 179 more?
It's just in case there are more forest fires, actually, right?
Could be, Richard. Maybe maybe that's it. But this is another one of those artifacts that people should wake up and say, what on earth do we need this huge increase in inventory? Now, of course, the military's line is that, well, we're replacing our old inventory. But to my knowledge, there has been no disposal of the old inventory yet. So,
do you think that the days that there's not spraying over a certain locality, like I've noticed where I am now in northern Arizona, on some days that there's no detectable lines at all, is that because they're really still don't have the number of planes they need to cover everything constantly?
Actually, here's what I think is going on, and this is probably the biggest issue within this topic that people need to realize is going on right now. When I lived in Jamestown, New York, I saw the spraying change overnight. Actually, there was a 4-day break. They were gridding the skies day after day to whiteout conditions, and all of a sudden there was a 4-day break with no spraying. On the 5th day, all the jets came back. The intensity of the air was just as bad, but the jets were spraying at high altitudes and leaving short, non-persistent trails. Same unmarked jets, but they were leaving short trails in the air was just as bad. Now, they had the occasional low-flying plane so that there were still some trails in the air, and I think that was probably because if there was such a dramatic change in the visual of the air that their propaganda that these were normal jet contrails would be debunked by their own devices. You couldn't have that sudden of a change, so you had to keep some of those persistent trails around. I spent a lot of time in Philadelphia visiting friends down there. Long story short, same thing happened. I saw the daily inundation of the Philadelphia area, and overnight, it wasn't a 4-day break this time, overnight they started doing high altitude, low, short, non-persistent trails. In Maine, the same thing happened in, if my memory serves me correct, it was 2010 is when it happened here. After 2 years of deluge, the bees died, our ladybug colony died. We had so many things happen here, animal die-offs, bat, fungal infections, immunosuppressive decline in populations of deer. And so they changed overnight to high altitude, short spraying. They still have some low altitude that leaves trails, but the vast majority of jets we have now are flying at high altitude with no jets, and now, or high altitude with non-persistent trails. And now we're seeing another step in the evolution of hiding this program from the public is we're seeing days where the trails are so clear that unless you stand outside and watch for the jets real carefully, you won't see them. The trails are very non-persistent, almost clear. You can just see them a little bit. And incidentally,
so
years ago,
technology is improving with basically the chemistry of how to formulate what they're spraying so that it will not be visible.
That is the logical conclusion. And fortunately, we had a whistleblower come out several years ago, and I don't know what happened to him. He's gone from public sight, but he actually made this statement in an interview. He said, "I would not be as worried about the things that they're spraying as the things they are mixing with the spray to make it dissipate quickly." That was his statement that really caught my ear.
Wow. Yeah, that would mean that those of us that still wanted to work with this would have to remember that these were once visible trails.
Yes, and that's another thing that should wake up the public. This is one of the things that those of us who are aware and watch the sky are shocked at the public's lack of awareness, is that these planes came in and rapidly, suddenly deluged the sky one day and did it for years, and now they're disappearing. Now it's not happening as much anymore, and there's days so what happened? You know, the government stories, oh, these are just normal jet contrails. Well, what happened? Did jets suddenly not use fuel anymore? Did the atmosphere suddenly change composition? I mean, what is going to be the cover story for the reason that you can go days now, and we're having this happen in Maine now too for the last several months, where you don't see the trails in the sky. Yet right. I can still smell and taste wave after wave, and if you go outside and watch, you'll see them flying at higher altitudes with really short, transparent trails. They're almost impossible to see, but if you look carefully,
I've seen the ones that are really high up, and they've got like maybe 1 inch, if you hold your fingers at arm length, about 1 inch of a white trail that just disappears quickly after that. And right. I didn't really know what that was.
Right, yeah. When you just use logic, when we all just use logic and know that historically these trails don't exist. They don't exist, and this is not a natural occurrence. Even the short trails, consider this, the wingspan of a 747 is a little under 300 feet, the size of a football field. When you're on the ground looking up, it just looks like a little harmless trail. What is that? That's nothing. No, that trail spreads out to be about 10 to 20 times the width of that 747 in 2 to 5 minutes? Well, 5 football fields wide. We're talking now more than half a mile wide. What is this? Furthermore, that's huge. We're talking about many city blocks. Right. What's also alarming and should catch people's attention is you're seeing what we call chemical aerosol fallout. Is you see something falling out of these things, and it hits the next layer of air, because there are layers of different temperature air, and they actually go in different directions. Like one layer of air may be going east and the other one may be going south. Right. these particulates will come and hit that layer and then start spreading out, streaking, making these wild patterns across the sky, but in a completely different direction. And so we're seeing these artifacts. Historically, those artifacts don't exist. I've never seen anything like that. Now we see them, every day practically.
I think some of the weather forecasters and reporters are even reporting that there are new types of clouds being discovered that are totally amazing in nature.
And isn't it
like these wispy white things that, are like you kind of airbrushed an area and you can kind of see through it and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another one of the many artifacts of the chemical aerosol releases. We have lots of artifacts that are all happening in the same decade. The animal die-offs and the insect die-offs and the spiking aluminum and mercury levels in the soils and the outbreaks of respiratory disease and the mental illness, the increase in mental illness. All of these things, chronic fatigue and Alzheimer's and dementia, all of these things just skyrocketing at the same time. Is this just a wild coincidence? No. Take a scientific or an engineering minded person should look at this and say, there's a logical explanation for all of this. Just put the pieces together, and it's like most things in life, it's right in front of you. Right in front of you.
Yeah, that's what the whole idea of common sense was. And I know that one of the big programs in media and higher education, and actually education starting from preschool, is to try to eradicate common sense.
Right. And you know what they do? It's transference is what it is. It's not just eradicating, in my view. They're transferring your common sense to science. So if a scientist...
And what science has become is memorizing acceptable material.
Exactly. What a great segue. I just wanted to read a couple quotes to you on this very subject. We are segueing into how they're transferring people using their own common sense to people trusting scientists above and beyond their common sense. Now, here's a quote. Can I read a couple quotes from you, from notable people? This should just shock you when you hear what I'm about to read to you. Here's a quote. It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reach slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. That is the predominant global medical journal. This was from Dr. Marcia Engel, editor-in-chief of the New England Medical Journal. I validated that this is real, and it's in the it's in the article called Editors, Publishers, Impact Factors, and Reprint Income. This is a real quote from somebody who was in the middle of it all. Here is another one. Interesting. Let's take this quote from the editor-in-chief of the second most predominant journal globally, at least it's considered by Wikipedia to be such. Here's the quote. The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Science has taken a turn toward darkness. This is Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of Lancet, published April 15th, 2015. Here's a couple other quickies here. Dr. John P.A. Ionides, I'm trying to pronounce his last name properly, professor in disease prevention at Stanford University, quoted saying this. He was quoted saying this. There's an increasing concern that most current published research findings are false. Here's the last one. One more quote. Here it is. When you have the power, you don't have to tell the truth. That's a rule that's been working in this world for generations. And there's a great many people who don't tell the truth when they are in power and in administrative positions. Dr. Dean Burke, American biochemist and senior chemist for the National Cancer Institute. So why do we have a transference in the world today from common sense to science? Because science is becoming the new opiate of the masses, so to speak. It's becoming the new object of our faith, and it should not be so. I believe common sense should always rule, and science should be subject to common sense. Not saying that we shouldn't find things that are not extraordinary and beyond maybe our instinctive thinking, but that if we find a scientist who says it's okay to put mercury in your mouth, we should use our common sense and have that checked thoroughly before we allow anything like that to happen and harm the people that have been harmed from it.
What about the scientists who figured out it would be the best way to save the earth to put mercury in all the new light bulbs?
We actually made a video on that. Let me tell the people this. That's exactly right. About every 5 years, conservatively, in the house across the United States, a light bulb is broken. Now that many or most, depending on the household, of those light bulbs are compact fluorescent bulbs, the twisty little spiral-shaped bulbs. When you break one of those bulbs, the state of Maine did a study, and so did we. We actually have a video showing us taking readings live from broken compact fluorescent bulbs on orbisvitae.com. That's our website that covers everything else besides chemtrails. When you do an EPA-approved cleanup after one of those bulbs is broken, even on a hardwood floor in your house, the levels of mercury that remain in the air after the EPA-approved cleanup exceed the levels that trigger an investigation in a contaminated factory.
So you would think that the EPA people know how to clean it up completely, right?
Well, yeah, the EPA has guidelines on how a consumer should clean up. And I'm not talking about a remediation team that you pay $2,000 to come in and do a cleanup in your house of a toxic substance, or a school if a thermometer is broken. Because if a thermometer is broken in a school, they generally will not have school until there's been a remediation team and they paid them thousands of dollars to come.
Thermometer thing is really interesting because I'm sure hundreds or thousands of thermometers broke in the past when they all had mercury in them.
Right, and now we have all these houses that if you go and you buy a house, you don't know if there's ever been a CFL bulb that has been broken in that house. And I have had people write to me. One of them wrote to me in the last year, said, we broke one. We didn't know. We broke one of these bulbs in our bedroom. We cleaned it up according to the directions. And my wife and I started having all kinds of symptoms, and they read some of the articles showing what the symptoms of mercury poisoning, and they're like, we have all these symptoms that have come, and we've been wondering what has been going on for the last year that we're getting so sick. Wow. So, yes, here we are in the United States, we're getting rid of mercury-based thermometers because we're dangerous, but we're now implementing something much more common and much easier to break. Have you ever broken a CFL bulb? It's much easier than an incandescent bulb. They break very easily.
No, I didn't know that. I try to avoid buying them at any cost and look for, there's still a few incandescents available for sale that you can get.
Right, and this is all done under the guise of protecting the public. And
saving the earth, too.
And saving the earth, right, from mercury, or from toxins and pollution.
From evil humans, I guess, yeah.
Right. Us evil humans have made the CFL bulbs and put them in our houses, but haven't been educated the fact that there should have been full disclosure. If you're going to, I don't think this should have been manufactured. Yeah, well, that's the difference
between the thermometers and the light bulbs, is that their thermometers, they never thought they'd get caught, so they were admitting they were mercury all the time. Now, when there's this irritating awareness in the public that mercury might not be really, a health food, then they stopped saying that was in the new light bulbs.
That's right. You have a great way of... Go ahead. You have a great way of wording things. Yes, mercury is definitely not a health food. Definitely not a health food. And I have experienced mercury poisoning, and let me tell you. And so here we have... in all these houses, we have something that's more toxic. We even measured the green bulbs. If you go, you can actually buy the bulbs with the fluorescent tubes with the green ends.
They're guaranteed to save the earth. Right.
They're environmentally friendly, but when you break them in an enclosed area, which we did, and we used a Jerome mercury vapor meter and measured, we actually got higher readings. I'm not kidding you. And I'm not saying this is scientific, because we didn't have completely controlled airspace. We didn't have a truly scientific experiment, but it was an experiment that showed such a preponderance of mercury. mercury that it really does say something important. So those green tip bulbs actually emitted more mercury than the non-environmentally friendly bulbs.
So this means not just the spiral bulbs, but all the fluorescent bulbs have mercury, right?
Yes, fluorescent bulbs have mercury. The long tubes you put in your workshop lights or in your kitchen, they have mercury in them, yes.
I recently changed some of those from a bunch of fixture that a friend owned, fixtures, and I thought, well, you have to recycle these in some safe way. So I was in the hardware store getting the new ones, and they said, oh, we'll take those. And the ones with the green dots, they just throw them away and let them break.
My mouth drops open at the policies. It really does. I remember when the spiral bulbs first came out, there were people in Home Depot at the front door, like right as you walk in the front door, they have a little table set up, and they were giving you safety information about these bulbs, telling you, no, they're perfectly safe, because there were some pesky people online saying they weren't safe. They had a program, and I'm not trying to diss Home Depot. I shop there all the time because I have to fix my own stuff, and it is what it is. Yeah. But these programs were implemented to lie to the public. They knew. Did they not have access to this information about broken bulbs and how they contaminate the air even after an EPA-approved consumer cleanup? Of course they did. Yet they're teaching the public that these are perfectly safe. Just make sure you bring them back to us when you're done with them. What if you break one? You know, one woman broke one. It made newspapers across the nation. It didn't make newspaper across the nation, but it went across the internet because it made one local newspaper. It cost her over, I think it was about $2,500 to have her mediation team come in and do a proper cleanup.
This was from breaking a fluorescent bulb?
A compact fluorescent bulb.
Compact, okay. But the green dot regular straight fluorescent bulbs still have mercury, right?
Yes.
Just a little bit less, theoretically, anyway.
They say it's a little bit less. In our test, our non-scientific test, they actually gave us slightly higher readings than the non-environmentally friendly.
Right, so just because they say they have less doesn't necessarily mean that it would be true. It just means maybe there was a straight cash payoff to get access to the green dots or something.
And that's the way the world really works. Straight cash payoffs. There it is. There it is. These people poison the public. This is Machiavellianism. Why is the pharmaceutical industry the second largest industry in the world behind petroleum industry? Because so many people are sick. And when you look at the model of things that legislation allows to be in the marketplace, like compact fluorescent bulbs, and the spray program that is going on over our heads, which Dr. Marvin Herndon has now confirmed has mercury. I was saying this for years. I wrote a long article where I told the public, I said, my symptoms from a certain type of chemtrail, not all of them, because there's different types. They smell and taste completely different, and they have different symptom set, although the symptom sets do overlap to some degree. But there's now 3 types that cause symptoms that are not only identical to mercury toxicity, but they cause symptoms that, to my knowledge and research, can only be caused by mercury. There are certain things like spiked dihydrotestosterone, which causes hair loss in men, extra hair growth in women, and sometimes hair loss in men, and other problems when you have spiking DHT. That is only caused by mercury, at least as far as my research has shown. And I had a whole symptom set because I had mercury poisoning below. Remember earlier in this interview, I told you that hopefully we would talk about this later, how chemtrails were related to mercury.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote an article talking about how uncanny it was that a couple types of the chemtrails that they were spraying, when I tasted them, that particular type, my business partner and I would both get mercury symptoms. And because we both had mercury poisoning from amalgam fillings previously, we know exactly what that symptom set is. We're very familiar with it because we suffered with it for quite a while.
One of the things about mercury, too, is that you don't need very much to be affected by it.
Absolutely true. A tiny, tiny bit of mercury does a tremendous amount of damage. So Dr. Marvin Herndon did research and published this research, and thanks to him, he's been doing some real cutting-edge research in this area. He's one of the very, very few highly credentialed people who have the guts and the courage to stand up and make these statements against all of the social pressure that is applied to all of the other professionals and scientists who are afraid to speak out. and go against the typical line that they're supposed to be repeating. And he analyzed residue from chemtrail fallout, and it actually matched the chemical signature of coal fly ash. Coal fly ash not only contains mercury, but arsenic and lead and cadmium and manganese and other things that can be harmful to human health. Yeah. But this is why we had all these articles come out saying the Grand Canyon is now contaminated with mercury and nobody knows where it's coming from. San Francisco is contaminated. I've seen all of these articles come out in the last 10 years where scientists are baffled. Where is all this mercury coming from? And what I would have to say to that is that mercury is one of the favorite poisons of the so-called elite, because it causes so many symptoms over such a long period of time that it's hard to trace, and it's hard to detect in the system with conventional means. You can't just do a blood test.
An environment that's contaminated with all kinds of other poisons, you can always say, well, because of that, we can't tell what's causing what.
Excellent point. Wow, you segue right into my thought process. It's amazing. Amazing thought. That's so very true. And in fact, I wrote an article explaining this in very simple terms, is that I believe one of the reasons that they're using mercury, besides the obvious fact that they love mercury so much because it causes such a great symptom set and their whole medical system is set up for the various symptoms and diseases that mercury causes. Right. That, they've already got all the pharmaceuticals and everything in place, so might as well just keep profiting from it. But here's the other reason, is that they were dangerously close to being caught in the vaccine industry for injecting people with mercury and having the public find out that all of those weird symptoms, all those horrible neurological symptoms that can come through some people who particularly don't produce as much glutathione, who don't methylate, they have an MTHFR gene or an APOE 3 or 4 genotype, which means that you don't produce the stuff you need to get rid of this stuff out of your body quickly. Those are the people who suffer. This information was coming out. So what better way, and I call it contaminating the control. Now, instead of having a set of vaccinated people like Dr. Eisenstein, was that his name?
He had a whole set.
We actually sold some of his DVDs and materials. He had thousands of patients, thousands upon thousands of patients, and he had lots of Amish patients too in his office. Yeah. And guess what? There were, out of the thousands and thousands of Amish, he had lots and lots of kids with autism and related, like ADD, ADHD. And I know that those symptoms come from mercury because I had them and they went away when my feelings were gone. 24 hours within 3 months. Most of them in 24 hours, many of them and the rest of them within 3 months were gone. And I lived with them since I was a teenager, since my feelings were put in. The racing thoughts, the inability to focus, the inability to pay attention. Well, Dr. Eisenstein, I hope I'm saying his name right, he passed away a few years ago, but he published information showing that only 3 Amish children had autism out of all of the Amish children.
Yeah. And he told me, I talked to him personally, and he told me that where there's no vaccination, there's basically zero autism.
Right, and guess what?
That should end the whole question, whether vaccines are great.
Absolutely. And those 3 children, those 3 Amish children who did have autistic or related symptoms, 2 of them were adopted from China, so they didn't know what the immunization history, but usually the adoptions are immunized. Right. And another one was from somewhere else, and they didn't have their history. So those 3 children who were from other countries, who were all likely vaccinated and adopted into Amish families, those were the kids who had those issues.
He told me that there were no autism cases where there were no vaccines. Yes. And I tried to get some of those records so that we could help, show everybody. And the family members that are in possession of those now are too scared to produce them.
That's what they do. And this, I believe, is one of the big reasons for including mercury in chemical aerosol injection, chemtrails. Mm-hmm. Because now you've contaminated the control. You no
longer...
Fresh air
is the control.
What's that?
Fresh air is the control.
Right. Like now, guess what? The Amish people are exposed to mercury. So now you don't have any two sets of people that you can divide, saying this set of people is mercury-free and this one isn't. I have symptoms now that are almost equal, mercury toxicity symptoms that are almost equal to the symptoms in intensity and variety as when I had 9 amalgam fillings in my teeth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, one of the things that also impacts the whole vaccine issue is that, when they started injecting mercury into people, which is totally unbelievable if you weren't familiar with it. Before that, ever since Jenner in about 1799 in the UK, when they officially started vaccines, they were maiming and killing people, mostly children at that time, and there were no adjuvants of any kind, let alone mercury, and they were still killing people. So there's something about the whole idea of vaccines that's deadly to the human body, and when you put mercury in, it just makes it that much more so.
And when you mix mercury and aluminum, it becomes 100 times more toxic.
Yeah. Synergistic toxicity, that's right.
So now with chemical aerosol injection, how will a court case ever be won regarding mercury against the pharmaceutical industry? Because now in court, when the family comes and said, my child had vaccines and had this reaction, and even if the family can isolate mercury as the cause, they can't isolate mercury or can't isolate vaccines as the source.
No, they're only having to pay people who can really show that, whether it was mercury or anything else, that right before the shot, the child was fine, and right after it, if they didn't wait too long to complain, the child was dead or injured. And they've paid out $4 billion so far in that secret court. But the program mostly is to make sure that no one ever finds out it exists.
Exactly. And now the pharmaceutical, and forgive me, I hope we're not having any audio problems. Our power just went out. Thankfully, I have power backup on our computers here. So
yeah, you can.
Oh, good. It went on and off several times, and now it's off. So if you hear a beeping in the background, that's one of the power supplies warning us that the power's out. But anyway, the attorney for the pharmaceutical industry can simply say, well, you've isolated mercury as the cause because of the symptoms set, or because of urine porphyrins, or because of different ratios in the blood or something.
The normal atmosphere is now 10% mercury, so everything's fine.
Now that you've got all of this mercury in the atmosphere and in the ground and everywhere in the whole environment, that lawyer for the pharmaceutical industry just has to say, well, we don't really know vaccines was where your mercury came from. Because remember, the vast majority of diseases that come from mercury don't happen until 5, 10, 20, 30 years later. And in fact, when I was doing one of the lab tests, the lab technician that I spoke to came to me and said, I actually spoke to him on the phone, and he actually told me, he said, how old are you? And I said, I was 35, because that's how old I was when I was having tests done in preparation for having my amalgams removed. He said, yep, that's it. And I'm like, what do you mean? He said, that's the age that right around 35 is when people usually discover that their whole life has been in one way or another influenced by mercury, and they finally discover that mercury is the cause. It takes that long for it to actually happen. And as that mercury continues to leak out of their fillings, people like me who are high testosterone are often not good mercury detoxifiers. And so the mercury accumulates over time, and it takes 20 years, 25 years, some cases 30, 35 years before these massive symptoms start to occur. And so how can they make that association? In a court, it's going to be very difficult to try to draw that kind of association. So they're very well protected now. The pharmaceutical industry has done a marvelous job.
Yeah, they've got some really smart people working in there. It's amazing how a lot of the people really working for total destruction are otherwise very intelligent.
It is. And I wish the public would be so. But I believe that those people who are in charge and who run the entertainment industry, that's part of it, is distracting people, keeping them entertained. I call it like the distraction when you move somebody's focus to something else, like, here, look at this show, look at this television show. Yes, you're being sprayed with poisons. Yes, your children are being injected. Yes, you're being completely obliterated with RF from your smart meters. And yes, your water supply is being contaminated from fracking. But don't look at that. Watch this incredible TV show where these celebrities are doing this fun stuff, and that's what you should be watching.
Yeah, exactly. And even when they, advertise deadly drugs on the television, which happens constantly, they say, talking really fast and not too loud, that all the ways that it might kill you, and then in a nice tone of voice, ask your doctor if it's right for you. And all these people are dancing around with bluebirds because they took the drug, and that's what sinks in.
And isn't it interesting that the pharmaceutical advertising is targeting the public? If the doctors were diagnosing your problem and then independently trying to make a decision on what would be the best treatment in your case, why would they be advertising drugs to the public, telling them to ask their doctor about this? Isn't that the doctor's job?
It's just a much more efficient way of getting more drugs sold, I guess.
Exactly. I think it's a way of getting the public conditioned and thinking in terms of, gee, I have symptom A, I need to take pharmaceutical B for symptom A, instead of actually finding out what the problem is. What is the actual cause? Like I was...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying that with my mercury symptoms, I am so grateful to my friend Amy, who changed my life just by revealing to me that mercury was coming out of those amalgam fillings. That was the pivotal point in my life. And who knows if I would have lived for another year with how badly my symptoms were manifesting, had she not said that one sentence to me, yes, your fillings contain mercury. And at that moment, I won't forget it the rest of my life. It was a pivotal point. I felt like I got hit over the head with the answer to the question I had been diligently searching for 5 years. 3 months later, because I had my amalgams out in 2 weeks, I researched like crazy. I took days off work. I had my fillings out in 3 weeks. I think it was after that, actually. After I learned it, it was within 3 weeks I had them all removed. And I had 4.5 years with no physical symptoms, no emotional symptoms, no panic, no anxiety, no fear, no digestive problems, no neurological problems, no headaches, no fatigue, no sleep issues, and on and on and on. And these were all from mercury.
One of the things you just proved also in that is that your emotional and mental state and what you're thinking about and how you feel, are highly influenced by the physical chemistry going on in your body.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and before I forget, that's another reason why I believe mercury in chemtrails is so very important to the pharmaceutical industry, to the powers that be, besides the reasons we already mentioned, is that there were an increasing number of people, and I knew some personally, who I was having continued conversations with, who had the exact same issue that I did, the exact same experience. They had their amalgams out, and everything that they had all their life went away, some within days, some within a few months. And just like you said earlier, that people were associating vaccines with their child's illness because of a temporal relationship. In other words, they get a vaccine and within a few days, they have all these problems. And so that's a temporal relationship. Well, likewise, if you have your amalgams all your life and you have problems all your life, or since your teen years is usually when they get them, and then you have them out and all of a sudden your symptoms go away. Well, there's a temporal relationship. That's evidence. Something changed and you had a dramatic change. Well, today, guess what? I wrote an article about this as well, that people are not recovering from mercury toxicity nearly as quickly as they used to. Why? Because you're breathing it every day. It's all over in the environment now. Yeah,
exactly. And, there's a lot of information that we're being given from not only Hollywood subliminally and overtly in images and archetypes and stuff, but also in the so-called news, where it's getting people to accept totally contradictory statements very close to each other as both being fine. And one of them, of course, is that the geoengineering and chemtrails is not happening and it's a conspiracy theory. And the other is, well, of course it's happening, but it's to save the Earth from global warming. And so one of the main reasons they're saying when they do admit it is that the only reason that the Earth is not incredibly overheated right now is because of the geoengineering. spraying, right?
Right. Another great segue, talking about scaring people away or diverting people away from good information. That what you just said, and this is right along the same lines. I had a heart attack in 2011. Never had a heart attack before, but I know this heart attack was caused by chemical aerosols because for years, when a certain type of plume, which is extremely inflammatory, would come to ground level, would reach ground level, I would get terrible inflammation and my heart would hurt to the point where I didn't know if I would actually make it through these episodes. This went on for years, and I tried all sorts of things with some limited success, anti-inflammatory herbs, dietary changes, and so on. And I did have some success with these things, but the onslaught of this chemical they were spraying is so strong that it still continued. Well, I had a heart attack finally after all these years, went in the hospital, they checked my heart. They didn't find any functional problems with it except one problem. My potassium was extremely low, very low. The nurse came in with 4 of what I call horse pills, these really big pills to give to me. And I don't take anything without asking what they're giving me. And I said, well, what are those? And she goes, that's potassium. And she looked at me in the eyes with this look I will never forget the rest of my life. She goes, your potassium is low. She said it like that, real extreme. Well, so immediately after I got out of the hospital, I started researching potassium in relation to heart attacks. Well, did you know if your potassium is low enough, you can start having heart fibrillations, and it can lead to a heart attack. So I started taking potassium supplementation, and I also started taking taurine, which is actually an amino acid that helps your heart maintain its electrolyte, potassium, calcium, magnesium levels in the tissue. But the potassium was the main thing. I started taking potassium supplements whenever that we would get hit with that type of plume that caused that heart pain, and it eliminated the symptoms almost completely. It was a complete turnaround from those symptoms. It was a really big breakthrough. Now, incidentally, in relation to what you just said about media, guess what? Television shows like House, which was a huge series, one of the most successful series with, what was his name? Jane. He's a British actor. I'm not calling it up right now. The Resident. There's been other series. There's a few movies out. There's been a pattern on television to scare people away from potassium.
Yeah.
In fact, if people are watching the series called The Resident right now, there's actually a murder that took place in a hospital. The murder was by potassium. Wow. Incidentally, the FDA, yes, potassium is being shown in all these series and movies as being something really scary. You got to be real careful about taking potassium.
Context, right?
In a medical context. And incidentally, the FDA years ago, after widespread spraying started, they limited over-the-counter potassium tablets to 99 milligrams per capsule. Now, how many people have I talked to, and I knew this would happen. If you need, your body can take a lot of potassium every day. Your body's very good at processing it. And if you have barium, which actually depletes potassium rapidly in your body, if you have barium exposure, you need more potassium to offset the barium, which is essentially binding and chelating out of your body the potassium, which is vital for your life. But if you only get 99 milligrams per capsule, there are people, and I've spoken to many of them, who I will tell them, I'll say, I take 10 capsules at a time. And like, oh my gosh, I can't take 10. No, that's too scary.
Right.
Whereas before you could buy them, no problem. But so the FDA's limiting of potassium over the counter, 99 capsules per milligram, I think was a psychological ploy in a way to keep people from getting the potassium, which would ultimately end in a dramatic increase probably in the number of heart attacks. Barium is so antagonistic to potassium. I'm sure you know all this. It's so antagonistic to potassium, but so our audience knows that it's actually used in animal testing to artificially induce heart attacks in animals.
Right.
So here we are breathing unbelievable amounts of barium in the air, very unnatural amounts. I live in rural Maine, and we had, I can't remember the numbers at the moment. I could pull them up, but we had barium in our rainwater.
Yeah. Incredible. And barium doesn't fly around in the sky normally, right?
No, we had 300 micrograms per liter of aluminum in our rainwater. No industry. I live pretty much in the middle of nowhere. There's a couple houses around here, but if you drive like just half a mile up the road, there's nothing. It's just woods all the way to Canada.
Yeah.
There's nothing here. And we had 300 micrograms per liter of aluminum, which is 5 times higher than the EPA recommends to be allowed the maximum amount in drinking water. 5 times higher in rainwater. So anyway, media, to get back to what you were saying, media is being used to divert, to scare people away, to propagandize people away from the solutions, and just propagandize them.
And that indicates that it must be because it's very important for them to achieve their goals, whatever those are. And one of the things before getting into the goals of the spraying, since you've mentioned a few of the ingredients, everybody talks about aluminum, barium, and strontium. But what else is known to be in those residues?
Well, the primary things, Dr. Marvin Herndon did a test and wrote a paper that was published on this. And the paper he published found mercury was one of the things he focused on, because here's the title of the paper. It's all in the title. Contamination of the biosphere with mercury, another potential consequence of ongoing climate manipulation using aerosolized coal fly ash. Well, what does coal fly ash have in it? Mercury? I believe it's ethyl mercury, so it's actually very bioavailable, or methyl mercury, just like the ethyl mercury in vaccines is extremely bioavailable. Cadmium, lead, arsenic, manganese, there's other things in there like calcium and other things that you might think of as beneficial, but there are all of those toxins that I mentioned are very toxic to the body, and they're all found in coal fly ash. And Dr. Marvin Herndon did us the honor of publishing that information for us.
So what do you think about the idea that that's the basis of the material they're spraying?
I think that's part of it. I know, because I can smell and taste them so definitively. There are different types. When a storm is
if they were all just fly ash, it wouldn't taste differently at different times, right?
Right, which isn't to say that there isn't some fly ash mixed in them. Right. When you look at some of these trails, you see the fallout, and you get the idea from some of the ones that have drippy edges. For instance, you see some of these trails and they have those like big teardrops falling down from one side of them. And I believe that's from the particulates falling down very rapidly. And I know a lot of people, on a side note here, I'll say this because a lot of skeptics go, well, stuff doesn't fall. It would take days to fall. No, it wouldn't. If you ever do a test, and I've done this, take toner, okay? Toner, which is the black toner, is, especially the HP brand, is primarily iron. Okay, It's encased iron with a coloring on it, and that's part of the fusing process that takes place in a laser printer or conventional copy machines. If you drop it off a roof onto a white piece of paper, just drop a little with your fingers, it will hit that paper almost instantaneously. It's absolutely shocking, because you would think, instinctively, that it would take a while for it to hit the ground.
Yeah, but it doesn't. Blow all over the place sideways, and it wouldn't fall very fast at all.
Absolutely, but I asked people to do the experiment. It hits the ground very quickly, and when I researched this, I realized it's because of the ratio of the size to its mass, and essentially the volume. So if you have a feather which has a large surface area but very low mass, it displaces a lot of air in ratio to the amount of gravity that's pulling on it, so it falls slowly. If you have a hammer, it displaces a small amount of air for the mass, and so it falls very quickly. If you were in a vacuum and you drop a hammer and a feather, you are removing the air displacement from the formula. You're removing that factor. Yeah, then they
fall at the same rate, right?
Right. It's very counterintuitive, but they fall at the same rate. Well, think about nanoparticle metals. Nanoparticle metals are very small, of course. They displace very, very little air, but they have high mass. So
because they're metallic, you mean?
Because they're metallic. They have high mass to air displacement ratio is what I should say.
Okay.
So because they're not displacing hardly any air at all, they fall very quickly. And that's been my personal observation. I can tell you by looking at the altitude of the jet about how long it's going to take until we smell or taste those plumes in the air.
Then there's also the non-metallic part, right? Because like we had Clifford Carnicom a couple times on the show, and he is one of the main things he does is test the residues, and he's found dried blood cells and other biological
mold spores
things. Yeah, mold spores and antibiotics, cross-domain bacteria that he can't identify with anything natural, and other stuff like that. So it's a mixture of quite a few different things, right?
Yeah, it really is a mixture, and everybody who's tested it finds different varieties. So because of the difference in taste and smell, and also the difference in when they spray, when a storm is approaching, they'll spray the type that I now call the barium type. I've never tasted barium, so I don't know what barium really tastes like. But because of the symptom set and because they spray it in front of oncoming storms, which then dissolves the storms, because barium salts are very sequestrant of moisture, and because we know that they have been used or tested with rainfall dispersion, I think that that's what they're spraying in front of the storms that can disperse them. We see storms coming in from the northwest towards the Bangor, Maine area, and they will spray between here and Moose Lake and just dissolve the storms. And I've seen this go on for years. And whenever they do that, whenever a storm is approaching, within 12 hours of an approaching storm, sometimes a little longer, I will taste that particular type in the air. So there is a different function for different types. So I don't think it's all coal fly ash, but that's not to say that coal fly ash isn't mixed in with some of the types.
It could be a major ingredient, right?
I think it can be mixed in because there are 3 types that actually cause me to have mercury symptoms, and there are other types that don't. And also with a sharp metallic type, which was first introduced in September in our area, that's when I first time I introduced or I tasted that type in the air.
Yeah.
That had biologics in it all the way through Christmas, and the night before Christmas Eve, they started spraying it like every hour, extremely intense, and then they did it day after day after day after day between the night before Christmas Eve and after the New Year's, and that's when we had the flu epidemic in the United States. That had biologics in it, very, very strongly. But shortly after that, in January, they continued spraying the sharp metallic type, but the biologics were not present anymore. So,
yeah. And when you get into the biological aspect, you also have to bring up at some point that humans are not the only organisms being affected.
We are having, for a long time, we're having bats die in the state of Maine. They're having fungal infections. We're having a deer population die off. And it just breaks my heart, makes me angry at the same time at the suffering of all life.
Right.
That people are just scratch their heads and say, why are all the deer dying? What's happening? Oh, and the news will have some Mickey Mouse explanation.
Right. We found a new germ that just came out of nowhere, and it only attacks these wild animals.
Right. Or all the rabbits are eating the grass or some,
Right, exactly. And then the deer eat the bats and everybody dies or something. But, and this is happening out in the wilderness, not close to industrial areas, so they cannot blame it on other industrial toxins. It has to be something that goes out away from the cities.
Exactly. And over the years of my studying geopolitics and being involved with a political party that was a very good party, in fact, they gave me insight to things that people often don't see. I saw the other side of how things work in a very positive way. That's when I learned that mainstream media just makes things up. That was my first exposure to that.
Very hard to believe for most people, yeah.
It's very hard for people to believe, but that's part of the reason you and I have to say it. Because
I was trained from, I think, second grade to believe that media was the way you feel secure because you know what's going on in the world and they will always tell you the truth. We would be listening to the CBS radio network for about 20 minutes of training every morning in second grade and then talking about the so-called news. And it never occurred to us that it could be anything less than total truth.
Absolutely, because our innate desire is to trust people. We want to trust people. We want to think.
Right.
Yeah. And so when I worked for this political party, this is the first time I was exposed to this, is that whenever there were things going on, like a rally about guns or something that the establishment doesn't like, then even though there were 5,000 people at the rally, the news that night would say there were 500 or maybe 1,000.
Yeah, they learn how to take pictures showing that there's almost nobody there, too.
That's exactly right. And during my entire time, that's when I was first exposed to it, and I was confused by it. I could not even believe it, even though I saw it. Every single event that we saw, we had people there who did head counts, who mainstream media not once told the truth about the numbers, and they always increase the numbers in certain subjects that they always like, and they decrease the numbers in certain event types that they don't like, over and over again. And the pinnacle for me, it all turned around when I was doing some research about Waco, because there was people saying that, the government started the fire at Waco and killed all those people. And I was very concerned. I'm like, I want to learn more about this. We got a hold of a tape from David Koresh, and he was telling people that he's not God. And he said it by saying, if I could move mountains, if I could do this miracle, if I could do that, then I am God. Yeah. And if you listen to the context, he's saying he's not able to do these things. He's not God. I saw that. This was the turning point of my life in finally accepting, after years of exposure, couple years of exposure, that the media lies at will. They showed that very same clip that I had already heard from his teaching tape where he said, I am God, except they didn't play the rest of it. They just played the part where he said, I am God. Right. And then they said, the newscaster said, we're David Koresh, who believes he's Jesus Christ. And then they played the part where it says, I am God. And I'm like,
sometimes they take the sentence where they say they're not God and take out the not.
Right.
They can just edit it,
That was the moment when I saw that clip. Chill went through my body, and I stood watching the television, and it took me a couple minutes to process. I'm like, you know what? I've seen the media lie to us so many times in the last couple of years while I've been, volunteering for this party. Right. And finally, I've got to accept it. I've got to accept that they just make up whatever they want, whenever they want, because there's no way that those people producing that newscast could have watched that clip and come to the conclusion that they gave over the air.
Well, and a lot of them, too, don't have to really compose what they're saying anyway. They just read it off a teleprompter.
Well, right. Exactly. I mean, I almost don't even look at the newscasters as the source of the news. I mean, there's a reason why routers and AP and API are the centralized sources of news. I think centralizing news sources was a big part of the agenda for decades.
Well, and they've done that even with weather forecasts now. They've recently told the local weather forecast people that they can't do the weather themselves anymore. And they have to take the nationally released weather forecast for every locality and just read it.
And I just read, very good point. And I just read a couple days ago that some organization, and again, I'll have to look into this further, but this is right along the same lines. Some organization that was helping people to put weather stations in their houses, on their property, so that people could go online. It was like open source weather. You could go see what the weather was like at any location. Right. They put these little miniature homemade electronic weather stations so that you could go online and check the weather anywhere, which I think is an awesome idea. Yeah. And they were shutting them down. They were saying, you can't do this.
Right. Well, I've noticed a coordination between the weather forecast and the spraying days, too. Because here where I am, northern Arizona, and most of the state has been famous for a long time with 300 clear days a year. And it's down to about a quarter of that now. And a lot of the days that are totally cloudy, there are no clouds. It's crystal clear except for the spraying. But they change the weather forecast in advance. So when they're going to be spraying heavily, they forecast clouds.
Yes. And here, it's taken them a while to get to that point for several years now, and they're changing it right now. I'm watching it change, but for several years now, we would have forecasts of 80, 90, 100% chance of rain. We would look on radar, and we'd see these big systems coming in from the northwest, and when they get to central Maine, they would spray them like crazy, and then you would watch the weather report just go, 50% chance, 40, 20, and that happened for years, over and over and over, where there actually was a lack of coordination between the spray program and the weather forecasting. I'm seeing that change now. I'm seeing that they're actually getting much better at lining those two things up. Yeah. You'll see a front coming in.
It's another aspect of centralization.
Yeah, we've actually just in the last few months seen fronts start coming in that we know are probably going to be sprayed away. And the weather forecast will say, 10% chance of rain or almost no chance. Right. And we're like, how could that be? A normal person was, how could that be? We have this massive front coming from the north over Moose Lake towards Bangor area. And then all of a sudden it just dissipates.
Yeah, exactly.
It just falls apart.
And the other people that should be interested in this whole subject are the ones that are wanting organic food and, realize its connection to health, because the spray, which is obviously accomplishing many different objectives, not just one, is changing it so that only GMO crops will be able to be grown in the soil.
I see that happening with a lot of things. We have mechanical bees or mechanical pollination systems that are replacing bees because of the bee die-off.
It'd be interesting to see what the mechanical bees do for making honey.
Well, and here you have this. So here you have this situation, which is exactly what you expect. If you see the big picture and you understand what the agenda is, they're going to charge everybody for everything, for all things that are necessary for life. So food is one of the fundamental things that they're gaining control over. Right. So even pollination process will be a paid process.
So you could rent the mechanical bees if you need things pollinated.
Exactly. You can rent the mechanical bees, and that process is something that that you're going to have to pay for.
Wow. What an amazing concept of an industry, being a mechanical beekeeper.
I saw the bee die-offs twice happen in Jamestown, because it was such a rich, lush, rainforesty type of area because of the lake effect snow and rain from Lake Erie. Literally, when you would go out in my yard, you would hear the hum of bees. It would the air would hum, and you couldn't go out with bare feet because you would step on a bee accidentally if you went across the lawn. There were so many. The year after the spraying started, the next summer, I went out, and you could hardly find a bee.
Yeah, it's pretty serious, because if nothing is pollinated, then it just echoes through the whole ecosystem and nothing else survives at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we have studies showing that one good study, I believe it's a good study, showing that the bees were contaminated with aluminum. And you were mentioning aluminum as destroying organics, affecting aluminum, as you know, free aluminum in the soil. I mean, there's bound aluminum in bauxite. No problem. You find that in clay. Yeah, it doesn't cause
problems at all.
Not a problem. I mean, it all works well. But when you have free aluminum, and Francis Mengels has done, USDA 35-year biologist, has done a lot of work showing the free aluminum levels rising in the soils. And what this does is the plants then shut off their mineral uptake. So your foods are now not as nutritious as they used to be.
Yeah, there's usually zero free aluminum or mercury in soil or air or water or anything else.
Right. And so you have these processes that aluminum will shut down this uptake process, and then you'll see stunted growth. You'll see less production. The main root system will be smaller. And incidentally, I have an old study from, 25 years ago from USF, University of South Florida, that shows the same effect from pesticides. They compared pesticide-grown food versus organically grown food back then. And the pesticide-grown food had 1/10 to 1/100th the amount of minerals in the food part, the consumptive part of the plant, than the pesticide-grown. The organically grown was much, much more mineral rich. So pesticides.
I've seen that too.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I have a sheet of paper and it just has all of the vegetables and that were tested and the amount organic detected. When you average it all up, and this is of course this has been going on a long time. And what effect cumulatively has this had on our health? And and most of all, they've known about this, Richard. This is not new information.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, most of this, in fact, so much has been known that we're not told about, including non-petroleum, clean and free sources of unlimited energy. And, Dr. Greer has been researching that. It's been available for at least 100 years. And the real information on health is violently suppressed, killing the holistic doctors that talk about it. Real information on anything environmental is forbidden. So we're in a really interesting situation at this point.
Yeah, and I think this is why military contractors and aerospace contractors, we've heard for years. I remember as a kid, they used to talk about on the news, or family members would gripe about how there was corruption in military contractors or other aerospace contractors where they would buy a hammer for $2,000, for example.
Right.
And people might wonder, well, why? How could that be? And they would say, well, that's just so the contractor can make a lot of money. Well, incidentally, when you start looking deeper into this, you find out that $2,000 went into advanced technology research that is hidden from the public. So that's a very clever method of getting public money to finance private technology development.
Right, exactly. And, just as a clue of how far that's gone, from what we had heard on a previous show of a guest who researched that, is that they mastered gravity control. In other words, basically magnetic flight without fuel in the 50s.
I have a friend who I've known since I was before being a teenager growing up in Florida. He went in the military. He had a semi-classified clearance. I don't know what he does. He didn't break any of his oaths, but he did say this one thing to his brother. I'm friends with their family. Mm-hmm. And he said this one thing. He said, I can't tell you what I do, but I will tell you this. We have technology that if you watch a science fiction movie, whatever you see there, we're way beyond that.
Yeah, that's exactly what we've heard too.
Yeah.
So
fast. Yeah.
Well, let's leave people with kind of a bottom line, encouraging open-minded exploration of everything, because in order to find solutions, you have to know what situation you're starting with, right? Accurately.
Yeah. Well, I think that having a knowledge of what's really going on in the world is absolutely critical, not just so you can work together to help fend off and these very destructive people who are doing these things and at least delay, if not get rid of these people who are destroying us and our health and the world. But also, it's very personal. It was just like me. Once I learned that mercury was my problem, I was very quickly able to solve the problem. But for all my life, having those health problems, not knowing that mercury was a problem, I had no clue where to look. And it typically takes 5 years from the date somebody starts looking to find out that mercury was their problem. At least back then it was. That's what the consensus was.
Yeah.
So it's very important to understand those what the real problem is, because it is very personal. So What would you say? Where would you want us to go here, Richard?
Well, we need to, unfortunately, wrap up this chapter, but I think what I would just encourage people is that, we're not the inept, incapable, stupid, helpless, dependent beings that we're supposed to believe that we are. And as far as science goes, you're supposed to believe that people with the most degrees are the most scientific. But anytime you do open-minded exploration without preconceptions of what's really happening, you're being more scientific than any of them. And everybody who wants to can do that and start learning immediately so that, you gain the power to take care of yourself and others better.
Absolutely. There's no substitute for being informed, and I don't know anybody who has become informed about the world and said, I'd rather be ignorant. I'm sure there's probably a few, because it can be very frightening and shocking, but it's critical for people to understand that the world that we learn about in school and on mainstream media and even in science today, like I read earlier, is very different from what we're being taught. And when you start learning how things work, you really begin to benefit. I believe I'm alive today because I understand the conspiratorial nature of the world, and therefore I'm able to keep myself healthy, knowing what my sources of toxicity are, and keep myself safe and protected in other ways, because I understand what's going on in the world and what's coming in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
And the consciousness that develops and the awareness and the self-reliance and the empowerment that relate from really learning and being willing to learn about what's going on no matter what's true enables you to not only take care of yourself better, but it's the only way that we're going to be able to take care of the whole situation, the whole biosphere, and everybody who doesn't know what's happening. I think the hope, coming to a positive conclusion is what each individual listening to us right now is willing to absorb and act on.
Exactly. I mean, when you care about your neighbor, I like to give this a quick illustration, is that when you really care about your neighbor and your neighbor gets sick and you start researching for them because you care, not because you're apathetic, because you care and you're motivated, you will begin to learn things you never would learn if you didn't care. Yeah. And in fact, I say, this is a saying I've said for years, I've said, people become knowledgeable about the things they care about. If you care about sports, you'll know who the MVP is. If you care about your children, you will know your children. If you care about the world and what's really happening, you will know about the world. So care about each other, and you'll know each other. Yeah,
isn't it interesting too? And I'm trying to finish here, but I keep thinking from what you're saying of more important things. And one is, I can tell you from inside the higher levels of the academic system right now, where I'm experiencing some interesting things, they are teaching the people who want to become certified scientists that two things you have to get rid of in order to be really scientific and be professional. One is have no emotion, and the other is have no opinion. And then you're going to do great as a scientist. So I really trust government guidance, and what that's telling us is those are the two things that you need the most. You need to be willing to feel, what's going on and read what your incredible feeling abilities are telling you that we've been tending to ignore, and then care about it, like Russ is saying, and be willing to do whatever you need to do for that is constructive.
Yeah, I kind of view human beings as very much, if you want to view them like a ship or a car. You have a rudder in a ship, you have a steering wheel in a car, and you have an engine on the ship, or sails, and you have an engine in a car, and your engine is the emotional passion you have that drives you, that makes you love, that makes you care about people, and that drives you to become someone who is active and not apathetic. But at the same time, you have an intellect which guides you. And I see what mainstream media and entertainment tries to do is tries to convolute and mix up the uses of those things. Your emotion has a place and has a function and has a purpose in our lives. Use it for that, but don't misuse it. And in the same way with intellect, you have intellect. You have the ability to reason and logically break things down into little pieces and do engineering. And so use that and don't misuse it, but let the two work together. Very much like voltage and current. If you're an electronics person, you can have all the voltage in the world, but if you have no current, there's no energy there. And if you can have all the current in the world, if you have no voltage, there's no energy there. But the two together are what make change, that make real change.
Yeah,
so use them both. Yeah,
that's right. And an example of what you just said with the intellect is that it can, if it's trained to do math, it can give you correct mathematical answers. But if you use that to say, hey, I could make 10 times as much money as a chemtrail pilot, the reason that you don't do that is not because the math is wrong. It's because your natural feeling tells you poisoning the world for money is probably not an acceptable thing to do. So you have to have that balance that you just talked about.
Absolutely. And I mean, caring, loving each other, if we, one of the ways we can know how important it is to be connected, to be helping each other, loving each other, is that's exactly what the powers that be try to get us not to do. They try to instill fear to separate us. They try to instill differences, whether it's racial differences or religious differences or other things. And I'm not saying that the world has to be an ecumenical council all joined together as one, like the Vatican's trying to do. I'm not making some all-encompassing statement, but I'm just saying your neighbor, whoever or whatever he is, your friend, your family, when you care about that person, it will become an education. You will become a student of that love and of that caring for them. And it's important. One of the evidences that it's important because the powers that be continually try to break you down from having that love and that caring, and instead try to replace it with fear. So you're afraid of your neighbor. You're afraid of trying anything new. You're afraid of this and you're afraid of that. You have to learn to live with confidence, courage, faith, and not in a state of fear and hatred and turmoil. It's a different mindset.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's a good assignment between now and when we get back together. Have everybody look for areas where they're living according to fear instead of love, and just fix that, and then we'll talk about it when you've completed that assignment.
That sounds like a great assignment. I've never heard that at the end of a talk show, but let me tell you, that's great. Very good. Awesome. Thanks
for being here, and hold on, and we'll say goodbye in the break. Well, there goes our friend Russ Tanner. I thought that was great. We've been waiting months to get a chance to have that visit, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully you understand that the chemtrails now, after that long talk about everything, they're not just to cause global warming or climate change, although they are apparently to do that, and they're successful at it, but there's a lot more to it. From the global rulers' point of view, they have so many other great advantages too. They poison the whole biosphere, all life forms, including us, plus the soil and the air and the water. It's just kind of incredible that level of crime could be going on. It's indescribable proportions, and I don't really think the individual governments are the ones doing it, because it's so well coordinated, and I don't think they would be doing that, but the global rulers are behind it, that coordinated cartel that's running a lot of the show now. But the individual governments and their officials are either so brainwashed they don't even understand what's going on, like a lot of the general public that still doesn't look up in the sky and see what's happening, or they're very likely blackmailed into silence. And if they want to keep their lucrative position in these various governments, then they don't talk about unacceptable subjects like geoengineering. We've got lots of evidence that that's going on. So I would say, though, that even if geoengineering were the only attack happening against us, and there weren't all these other things, it would be potentially fatal for the biosphere, for the life on Earth. But the reality that we're in this situation is that it's one of many simultaneously conducted assaults against all life here. And it's a pretty serious situation, to say the least. And I'm not advocating that you get all upset or angry about it, because contrary to what a lot of people think, that does not make you more effective. It just makes you more upset. And it's really hard on your body for no reason. So I'd rather have you be really aware of it, but in a calm, clear, stable place inside yourself, realizing that you don't have to be stressed about it. You just have to strategically decide what to do. And this is where your real potential comes in. Because as far as I can tell, the biggest taboo, the most important information that we're all supposed to not know about is not even the existence of chemtrails or the GMOs or chemical agriculture or drug medicine or any of this junk, EMF. The biggest taboo information is who you are. Not philosophically, not in a religious manner, not in a belief system way. I don't mean any of that stuff, because that's just to give you something, to hold on to while everything else is destroyed. I'm talking about something real, actionable, incredibly powerful tools that have been forgotten. To even understand that each one of us is a transceiver, a receiver, and a transmitter of frequency and energy. To even understand that and how you can use it, you've got to heal your own body and mind. Because if your body's really toxic, which almost everybody living in this kind of environment, eating poison food and drinking poison water and drinking this compromised air, it's very hard to have a clear mind and clear emotional state. But that's normal for you, and you can get back to it. And that's really what the Lost Arts Radio project is all about. It's giving you tools that you can use when you decide you don't want to just believe that drugs are the way to get healthy, which is what the medical industry wants you to think, and they've brainwashed all the doctors to believe that. That's not true, guys. It covers things up at great expense and comes out in the form of other worse problems over time. So once you decide that, hey, there's something wrong with the usual approach to health, and you decide you've got to take responsibility for it yourself, or else, the results are not going to be that great. That's one level of what we want to do, is provide that information and those tools. But that's level one. That's the beginning. So if you just use that and learn the most you can and stop there, that's fine. You still get a lot of benefit. But what I'm suggesting is that my hope is that a lot of us, at least thousands, and we don't need a huge number compared to the global population, but I'd like to see thousands of us get clean enough physically and work on our mental, emotional states, like we talk about all the time, to be able to start perceiving these finer levels and learning how to tune in to the current that you need to connect to in order to become a powerful transmitter. And that's really what you're not supposed to know about. So I'm just encouraging you to learn. Keep learning. Don't take anything as not okay to question. That's the belief system and brainwashing system that, it's like making religions out of everything that you can't question. Real learning questions absolutely everything and just wants to know whatever is true. That's real science, which is almost lost today, but it still exists. And that's real spiritual inquiry, as opposed to religious, just a belief system. Because if you're committed to finding out what's true, you're going to find something really good. And you're going to find out who you are. And once that happens, which you're not supposed to ever even think about, you're going to learn how to tune to these finer energies to make you very powerful contributor to the harmony on this planet and turning things completely around. That, in what I've found in 50 years and more of experimental research, is the biggest secret, more than the health stuff that these doctors have been being assassinated for. That consciousness, information, and action is even more important, even more powerful. So I'm encouraging you to learn any way you want to get closer to that. You're going to have to fix your health, your energy, and everything you can on the physical level to really get into it fully. So on these Sunday shows like this one we're just finishing now with Russ, these are for filling in gaps in our education, including mine. And I feel really fortunate to be in on this with the front row seat with all these wonderful people, all of you and the guests that we have. But then we also have the Saturday show, Lost Arts Radio Live, which is... It just started recently on Saturdays at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's just to look at a little bit of what's going on in the world for an hour or so. But after that, we have the deepest part of it, which is the club meeting. And I hope if you are brave enough to really get into working on yourself in depth, that you might come join us. You can get in at lostartsradio.com/club. If you're interested in that, that's an interactive video platform we started in January. And on that somewhat more protected, private environment, we can talk really freely about the information that I want to share with you, even applied to your individual life and health situations, not medically, because of course not only is that prohibited in our environment, in our society, only the official drug doctors can do that, right? Those are the priests in that religion. But we don't need to go into it medically in order to share information that will be radically helpful to you. And if you're willing to, you can use it to transform your life for the better on an incredible level. I mean, that's what that new club, Planetary Healing Club, is about. And it's private, but you can get in if you want to. lostartsradio.com/club. But if you're not interested in that, also watch our YouTube videos that I'm putting up more and more frequently now. And if you have things you want covered in those, just let me know on the Facebook group, Lost Arts Radio Facebook page, or the forum on the website, lostartsradio.com, or email them in at richard@lostartsradio.com, and I'll address them as soon as I can in the videos that I'm making on YouTube, as long as we're allowed to stay up there in spite of the censorship that's happening. So far, we're still there. But the club format is more private, so check that out too if you get a chance. And otherwise, I hope you have a great week. I hope everything goes really well for you. Hope your learning is going well and your application of everything that you're finding out to be useful. And I will see you next weekend.
Introducing Lost Arts Radio Live, our new Saturday late afternoon, early evening 1-hour live stream show. This new show precedes our Planetary Healing Club, which starts at 9 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Pacific. The Planetary Healing Club, which is not free and open to the public, but you can join for a minimum donation of just $10 a month. Our new live stream show, which is free, starts Saturdays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and 4:30 Pacific. It can be accessed by going to lostartsradio.com/live. You can tune into our live stream from our Facebook page at facebook.com/lostartsradio, from our YouTube channel at youtube.com/lostartsradio, as well as both Periscope and Twitter at Lost Arts Radio. You can ask questions during the show by using the chat function on YouTube, or make a comment on Facebook during the live stream. Once again, that's Lost Arts Radio Live, Saturdays at 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific. As of January 2018, the Saturday live call-in show is now an interactive video platform called the Planetary Healing Club. The cost is just a $10 minimum monthly donation, automatically billed through your PayPal account. Sign up at lostartsradio.com/club. The Planetary Healing Club is every Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. You get your link to participate in the show upon signing up as a member. Those shows are also archived as well for club members. Listen to our new shows with guests every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. All Sunday shows with guests have archives freely available on our website at lostartsradio.com. You can also find them at blogtalkradio.com/lostartsradio, as well as our YouTube channel, youtube.com/C/lostartsradio. Mixcloud at mixcloud.com/lostartsradio. And finally, look us up under the podcast directory on iTunes. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/lostartsradio, or on Twitter at Lost Arts Radio. Be sure to join the free Lost Arts Radio Facebook group as well. Just search for Lost Arts Radio Group within Facebook. You can also join our forum on our website if you want to interact with other listeners. We also have links to all of the great independent musicians whose music we feature each week on Lost Arts Radio. When you do your Amazon shopping, please use Amazon's Smile program at smile.amazon.com. And when you choose Lost Arts Research Institute in Sedona, Arizona as your charity, Amazon will donate 0.5% of whatever your order total is to Lost Arts Research Institute to help fund the building of the school and keep our radio show on the air. Please visit lostartsresearchinstitute.org for more information on the school we want to build. Be sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter on our site under the Radio Show tab, or right from the button on our Facebook page. Contact Richard at richard@lostartsradio.com, or myself, Doug Diamond, at doug@lostartsradio.com. Thanks again for listening to Lost Arts Radio, and we'll see you again next week.
When you feel your heart is troubled and you need some love and care, you know that I'll be there to help you out. Can I get you some cold water? Would you like a book to read? Is there anything you'd like to talk about? Maybe if you feel like we can go out for a ride, I'll be here to do with you whatever you decide. I just want to let you know we can't let our feelings grow, because we seem to have the love and care. Well, I care about you. I feel that you're a friend and that you care about me too. It's so nice for someone to know they have a number one. It's nice to be a number one for you, to care about you. If the wind was blowing in the way that you were going, I'd walk in front of you to clear the air. That would be to let you know that we can't let our feelings grow, because we seem to have a love and care. Well, I care about you. I feel that you're a friend and that you care about me too. It's so nice for someone to know they have a number one. It's nice to be a number one for you, to care about you. I really do care about you.